I am Dr. Kristen Ketley from Clarion University. I'm an assistant professor there in the Department of Special Education. And I'm going to talk to you today about evidence-based supervision. Supervision and coaching is something that I study and have a really big passion for because of the experience that I had as a teacher who had a coach in my classroom and felt very uncomfortable with it, but then also realized how amazing it was at the same time. But that also was someone who was a supervisor at the same time, that experience of coach and supervisor at the same time. So we're going to talk about supervision in both of those capacities today, as administrative supervision, but also as coaching, because I know that some of you might be in that dual role or even move from one to the other frequently. Just in general, the things that we're going to talk about is a 7-step protocol that will give you an evidence-based way to provide supervision in your schools, your systems, your districts, whatever it may be. We're going to look at some real-life application of that as a way to try to connect it to your system or your school district so that it's something that you can actually take back and put into action tomorrow, and really look at the measurable, observable actions that you could take to affect change through your supervision practice. So how many of you in the room right now are administrators and are providing supervision in that fashion? Good amount. And how many of you are actual teachers who maybe are receiving supervision or coaching? Okay, and what about just straight coaches? Is there anybody who's not a supervisor but just straight coach? Great. Okay, so all of this will impact all of you. I'm going to use a little bit different terminology in terms of supervision and consumer that I'll explain as we get there so that it encompasses everybody that's in the room, but also our students, because even though we may be at the administrator level or coaches or actually the people in the trenches day in and day out as teachers, ultimately what we're impacting is our students through this process. So the biggest thing that I constantly remind people and want you guys to remember is to try to be that supervisor that you always wanted but you never had. I've had great supervisors, only 2, and I've had terrible supervisors. And I've learned a lot from both, but the most that I've learned has been those supervisors that I don't want to be. And I remember that every single day, and it's something to kind of bring me back to the point of how do I want to be extending my practice to build a legacy, ensure quality in the field, and really shape our craft. Because we have a huge impact. Even though you may not be that person who sees kids every day anymore, you have a huge impact on the actual goal attainment for the children that are in your schools. And it's all about building that legacy. So the supervisor that I constantly remember that I don't want to be was the supervisor that I had when I was getting the experience hours for my BCBA. And the guy, he would come in, I would see him twice a week. He would come in and he would just sit down. No agenda, no plan, no content to what we were doing. And I was hungry for it. I wanted him to tell me what to do, how to get better, what I could do to help the situation that I was in. And he wanted to talk about the trip that he went to with his wife to Hawaii. And there needs to be a little bit of that relationship building when it comes to supervision. But I said a little bit. And it was everything. That's all he did. There was no actual supervision happening. There was no skill development happening. So I don't want to be that supervisor. Instead, I want to be that supervisor that has a plan and is doing something and is pushing, but gently, the people that I'm supervising as a way to really ensure quality in the field. I want to work myself out of a job, and hopefully you want to do that same thing by making sure that the people that we have in place within our schools, our systems, our districts are really shaping what we're doing and ensuring quality for our students. So there's tons of research about what effective training is. What is the thing that's going to work to help teachers or people that are in schools really improve what they're doing, learn new things? There's tons of it. I was reading more of it this morning. But what it comes down to, if you really whittle it all down, is quality mentorship and supervision equals effective training. Those two things together, mentorship and supervision. Part of both of those is this training component, this skill development component, and it leads to effective training. I'm gonna fall on this cord. Sorry. It leads to effective training, and that's ultimately where everyone wants to go, so that we're using our time most effectively when we have those little moments with our school teachers. And there are some practices that you can do to enhance that specific training. This information here is specific to future behavior analysts, but it doesn't only apply to behavior analysts. So if you read those 5 things, establish an effective relationship, use a structured approach with content and competencies, evaluate your effectiveness, get ethics and professional development in there, and then continue that relationship post-certification, that doesn't apply to just behavior analysts. That is something that we need to be constantly incorporating in what we're doing within our schools. And the one thing that we're gonna not to talk about with the 7 steps towards evidence-based supervision is the last one there, and that's continuing that professional relationship post-certification. You want to make sure that the supervisor that you are is the person that people come back to. You want to be that wealth of knowledge or support so that you are continuing that relationship. So if someone has a question, you go back and you are the person that they ask. You want that because that means that you did your job and you did your job well. And it never stops. So if you are the supervisor or the mentor for someone, it tends to never stop. There are times where I will still go reach out to supervisors that I had previously because I'm in a situation where I don't quite know what to do. So that helps you know that you did your job and did it well. This information came from the Behavior Analysis Certification Board last year. They put out a white paper on the top ethical violations within our field as behavior analysts. And one of the top violations was improper or inadequate supervision. Top violations, that's huge. And if you think about the situations that you guys may be in or the schools that you're in, you can probably be like, yeah, that person shouldn't be a supervisor, or yeah, that person isn't doing the best job. So this is not, once again, specific to behavior analysis. It's just a way for me to pull the information and talk to you about it. But it really relates to everywhere that I think we are. And if you think about it, typically, if you're good at what you're doing, your current position, people will say to you, hey, why don't you become this supervisor and start teaching other people what you do? But do you have the skill set to be able to do that? Is that the way that we want to be developing supervisors? Or are you just kind of thrown to the wolves and you have to figure it out as you go and hope that you're doing a good job? Honestly, the way that it works the most is you get thrown to the wolves and you don't have the skill set. So if you're an administrator, you probably went to school for certain pieces of information, but really did that prepare you for those teachers that are in your school that maybe aren't doing what they're supposed to do? Did it really prepare you for that everyday interaction with people? The answer might be no, and that's okay, because it is a skill set that needs to be developed. So the protocol for evidence-based supervision that we're going to talk about today has these 7 steps, and it comes from the work that Reed, Parsons, and Green did, and they have a fantastic guidebook that really can help structure this for you and give you more information if you're interested. It is specific to the human service fields, so it aligns very well with how we interact in schools. And they have done a lot of work around this as well in terms of articles, podcasts, other pieces of information to provide a way to build your skill set as a supervisor. So those 7 steps that we're going to go through are identifying your desired outcome, really specifying what staff must do to assist consumers. And remember, I told you I was going to use that word. I'm going to use the word consumers because it has to do with you as the administrator, the teacher, the coach, but then also the people that you are impacting, because even if you're a teacher and you're not supervising anyone outside your classroom, you're still having to supervise people that are coming in, and that may be the paraprofessionals in your classroom, it may be the speech language pathologist who comes in. There's still a supervision component when they are in your area. It can also then mean your students, because there's the trickle down about if you are getting good supervision, you're having a more effective impact within your job, and then that has better outcomes for our students. So if I group all of that population together and just use the word consumers, it kind of incorporates everyone. We of course have to have a training component, monitoring staff performance, and then supporting that proficient staff performance, and then correcting the non-proficient staff performance, and always continually evaluating. So if we get into each one of those steps, the first step is to identify the desired outcome. A lot of times when we are supervising adults, we forget to tell them why we're doing what we're doing. We forget to give them a roadmap about where we're going and the why behind it. We just say, this is what we're doing. If you are starting implementation and are starting Tier 1, have you explained to your staff why you're doing what you're doing? If you haven't, that might be something that you might want to do to help really identify those desired outcomes. And then really looking through assessment at what skills need to be developed. And this can be done individually in terms of this one teacher maybe down the 5th grade wing, or it can be done as a system. You really need to think about treatment implementation and ethics, but the two things that really can affect any type of treatment implementation and where you might find a lot of your supervision efforts lying are professional behavior and interpersonal skills. A lot of times we think that doesn't necessarily fall under our job because these people are teachers, they were hired, they're just supposed to know what to do. But in reality, there can be some big barriers in terms of lack of interpersonal skills and professional behavior. And a lot of your supervision efforts might fall there because of that. I think about it in the same way. I taught kindergarten and 1st grade autism support, and I thought that first day of having my classroom that the kids would just come in and know exactly what to do, and they would sit in their seats and we would line up at the door and we would go to the water fountain and everyone would walk in the hall and be awesome, and I would have the most cool classroom and be teaching reading and math, and it would be amazing. And the reality was they didn't have the skill to do it. We assume that we have teachers coming out of teacher prep programs that know how to do these things that we're putting forward, but they often don't have the skill to do it. So your expectation and the reality don't match. So you really have to think about and communicate that desired outcome, and then the other steps will help you to get to where you need them to be. We of course need to think about goals. A lot of times your goals are established maybe even higher than you, but it's all about communicating that goal again. Making sure that you really operationally define that goal. And that means break it down as small as you possibly can. Because a lot of times if you're a big vision administrator, that's great. It sounds great to go where you want to go, but it can be overwhelming to your staff to think about all the small steps that go there. It will help your staff if you already identify all of those small steps and communicate that in conjunction with your big vision. And always making sure that you are asking questions, as well as creating a culture that it's okay for your staff to ask questions as well, and encourage them. And not in a way that is necessarily challenging what you're putting forth, but just as a way to gain more information, and also have the ability for you to give them like an introspective view into what you want to be doing, so that they're understanding we're going to do X, Y, and Z because, and you are giving them that view that they then can take and emulate if possible. So once you have identified those desired outcomes, you need to really specifically specify how you're going to get there. So we know that we live in this high stakes era. That's just the reality that we are in. But what are the small steps, especially for the staff that may not be proficient, that we can get them to do that will get us to this desired outcome, or whatever desired outcome you may be working towards? If you can take that information and task analyze it, so you're breaking it down into very small, discrete skills or steps, and you maybe work on or communicate just some or one of those at a time, you're going to see more success because your staff will be more willing to have buy-in. And there is more opportunity then for you to correct or reinforce. So correct the non-proficient performance and reinforce those people who are doing it. And that's another thing we're going to talk about in a little bit. You really need to give a description of the behaviors that are required to complete whatever step you're putting forth. So it can't just be, this is what we're going to do. It needs to be, this is what we're going to do, and this is how you actually are going to do it. And in the same fashion that you would be teaching how to do a math problem, you need to teach to your adult staff how they are going to reach the goal that you are trying to attain. Of course, you need to think about supports. Sometimes that can be a big barrier, especially if we're talking about something that requires money or staffing or all of these barriers that we deal with every day. But it does need to be identified. And then if it's something that you can do, I would definitely structure what's happening, and this may not be the most appropriate example for those of you who are already administrators in certain places, but you may need a contract. It may not be, like I said, appropriate everywhere, but the thing that I do think is appropriate everywhere is a handbook with expectations. So if I'm coaching, I, of course, establish a contract, but I'm coming in as someone who is an outside entity typically. But to go along with that contract, I have a handbook that says, this is what you can expect from me, the actual observable behaviors that I will engage in, but this is what I expect from you. And to go along with that, then there's data collection and evaluation, which once again we will talk about. But those expectations are outlined from the second that I begin working with people. That gets away from a lot of problems later on. It also gives me backup if there are problems. So I highly recommend that being part of your practice. Because you can't really effectively assess performance if you haven't outlined what those expectations are that you expect people to do. And it needs to be very specific. There can then, to go along with that, be some documentation and completion of assignments. So if you say, as the coach that's going into the classroom, I want to see this new reinforcement system that we've talked about up and running by the next time that I come in, that's in 2 weeks, you should document in that next 2 weeks if it was done or not done. And not in a way to evaluate the person or get them in trouble because they didn't do it, but as a way to then say, okay, why didn't it happen? What can I help you do to make sure that it does happen? What else can we problem solve because maybe you tried it and it didn't work out and they abandoned it? Well, what can you do then as the coach or the administrator to help? Because it really needs to come down to identifying why things weren't done instead of just saying, no, it wasn't done and moving on. And the other thing that's very important and something that doesn't happen a lot is teaching, or at least setting expectations up around how to accept and receive feedback. Feedback can be very uncomfortable. And if it's something that you don't create kind of that safe space for, it can be even more uncomfortable. So if you model to the staff that you are working with how to take constructive feedback, it can really just give them a way to accept what you're saying, or at least act in a professional manner in that specific moment, especially if you have a teacher who you're a little bit nervous to say something to because you know that they're going to react badly. If you set that up, there's head nods in the front, it's true. If you set that up from the start, then it will take away some of that fear associated with your presentation and their potential reaction, and allow you to have a more collaborative conversation around whatever feedback you're trying to give. And if you can really describe those behaviors that you want to see as you're giving feedback, that can also help in a lot of ways. So if I say to you, when I'm giving you feedback, I would really like you to show me these types of things so that I know that you're listening, such as nodding your head, taking notes, writing down questions that you want to ask me. That gives the person a framework for how they can act, and it's also building those professional behaviors as well. So once you have done that, you've told them what the goal is, and you've really specified this is how we're going to get to that goal, it's all about training from here on out. So you have to really train those skills that have been identified in step 2. So it has to be something that's performance and competency based. And the way that you can effectively actually address both of those things, performance, so let me see you do this skill, and competency, this is the reason why you're doing the skill, or the basis behind it. If you really want to address both of those things, you should use behavioral skills training. And that is those, I feel like there's steps upon steps upon steps in this, aren't there? This is the 5 steps there of behavioral skills training, which you probably actually already do. But if you really become aware of it, it will become the way that you train. It will become the way that you teach. And if you really look at what those steps are, it follows the model, lead, test procedure that we want our teachers to be teaching. This is the exact procedure that I teach all of my pre-service teachers what to do, or how to do, no matter what the content is. And you should be doing the same thing for the people that you're supervising. So describe the skill to be trained. Yes, great. The second part is what people forget to do often. Provide a written summary of the skill to be trained. You are not constantly with the people that you're supervising. You're not constantly in the classrooms that you're coaching. So if you provide the written skill in a very detailed way, of course, the task analysis that maybe we've already identified, that stays there. It gives them something to refer back to. It gives you something to refer back to when you come in 2 weeks and you say, oh, not quite getting there. Let's work on steps 1 and 2 that we have written down. So it's very important, and it just provides another modality for people to understand. And then moving into demonstrating the skill. So you need to be able to walk the walk. If you're saying, I want you to put this in place in your classroom, you need to be able to show them how to do it. This is the rehearsal part of things, or the modeling that you need to be putting in place. And then have the trainee practice the skill in front of you to provide feedback. So you're gonna say, okay, I just did it, let me see you do it. And I'm gonna see if you did it okay, and I'm gonna tell you what you can do to improve, because you've already set up those expectations about providing constructive feedback. That's gonna continue until the person is at a point of mastery. And you've already identified what that point of mastery is, because you are all really, really good administrators and supervisors. So they're gonna know exactly what that skill looks like and feels like before you ever leave. So once they're able to do it, you're gonna fade yourself out so that they can be those independent, amazing teachers or paraprofessionals that you know that they are, but you're not done. You need to continually have some type of data collection that is also performance and competency based. The competency based information can come with just a conversation, making sure that they have the vocabulary, the terminology down with what it is that you want them to be able to do, but it does need to be something that's objective and systematic. So you want to make sure that it is not happening for one person because they're your problem teacher within the school. It needs to be something that is just the way that you implement things. And once again, you're going to establish and communicate that mastery criteria. Anytime that you can have some discussion around that content or knowledge that you're putting forth, it will help you to know, did you meet that competency-based goal that you were putting forth? Were they able to define and give terms? Did they make sure to speak in a way that you knew what they were talking about, but can they flip that to be able to talk about it that it would make sense to a parent? Part of our ethical code as behavior analysts is to be able to speak in behavior analytic terms and non-behavior analytic terms. But once again, that should not just be for behavior analysts. It should be for teachers. We have our own way of speaking. We have our own way of communicating, especially when you're implementing something the way that you guys are in your schools. You can get into those trenches of speak that other people don't understand. But it's very important that you come out of that and practice both that way of speaking and just kind of the layman's terms around it. If you can do that, you have a better understanding of the skill itself, but also it can communicate to more people what you're doing, which is exactly what you want to have happen. And for the performance-based content, really make sure that you're focusing on the correct performance to that level of mastery. And the level of mastery that you set for each person may be different. So if you have a really, really good proficient teacher and you can just kind of let them go and fly, their level might be very different than the brand new teacher down the hall who has all of these things that they're trying to learn and do, and they're doing a good job, but they just need more support. So you can differentiate that level of mastery based on kind of just the proficiency level of those teachers. That does take a little bit of skill, and that does take a little bit of time, but it is time well spent if you're able to do it. And then the other part that, if you have the opportunity to do, will really give you a lot for your time, is role play or performance with direct observation. So anytime that you can role play, and I'm one that hates role play, but it is so valuable, if you can actually get your teachers in that situation, it gives them a way to practice, and that practice is very important. And if you're able to model something during that role play or have someone else do it once through, and then for the second time that you run the role play through, freeze or stop what you're doing, explain why you're doing it, and then start again, so that you're once again giving that view as to why you're doing the behaviors that you're doing. If you have a really seasoned teacher who's really good at certain parts of their job that you're trying to get the other teachers to do, that's the perfect opportunity to have them role play, stop, freeze, and explain. And then the performance with direct observation, you probably have to do a large amount of direct observation just for the evaluation systems that we use today, but that can be paired with some of this information as a supervisor that we're talking about to monitor staff performance. There's easy ways to do it that are already things that you have done. So if you have already task analyzed what needs to happen in order for someone to really implement what you're asking them to do, that check sheet can just become treatment fidelity, meaning you just sit back and say, are they running these steps as we meant to have them run? And it can be a simple yes or no, or a check mark beside it. It doesn't have to be recreating the wheel, but you're still getting information to monitor staff performance. And of course, we want to be able to support proficient staff performance. I think this is a place where a lot of people get forgotten. So if we have those good teachers, or the people who are doing what we've asked them to do, they're the ones that we leave alone, right? They're the ones that we don't need to spend our time on. But they are the ones who are at risk for drift, meaning that they start to do things less and less with fidelity just because that's the way that we are as humans. But they're also the ones who, when they come up with a situation that maybe is difficult for them, is going to take longer to get help because we leave them alone. So making sure that you're still actively responding to their performance, even though it's nice and proficient, is important. And it can be kind of moving into supportive supervision, which is more just a check-in, or a, hey, do you need anything? Or I really liked the way you, so that you're providing that specific feedback to them as well, in the same fashion that you may those kids that you don't really have to spend a lot of time on for their behavior. Doing those little actions will promote quality over time and help you to avoid drift, or help you to identify when drift is occurring faster. And we'll talk more about drift here in a second. Anytime that you can provide them reinforcement, you need to do it, so that they know that they are not alone, that you see as the administrator what they are doing, and that you're helping to boost morale. There's tons of ways to do that. I'm sure that you guys already know how to do that, but one of the other things that you can do for those people who are proficient, and not in a way to add more to their plate or give them more to be doing, but as a way to support what they are doing if they would like to do what you're going to provide, is to really just keep pushing their ethics and their professional development by providing them some of these resources, like maybe they get to go to a conference. Maybe you have a book that you read that reminds them of something, or reminds you of something that's happening in their classroom, and you put it in their mailbox to read. Provide them journals, send them articles to say, I saw you do this in your classroom, and this is what I just read about, great job. And once again, not as a way to say, you need to read this book that's more work because you're doing a good job, but as a way to say, I recognize what's going on in your classroom and I support it. And look at the great job that you're doing. And that can really just kind of keep pushing their proficient performance. And here's the big one. Correcting non-proficient staff performance. We all have it. We all have these people. So what do you do about it? Well, what you do is steps 1 through 5. So before you can actually move to any other type of plan, you need to make sure that you really review those previous steps that we've talked about to see what else can be done. And the what else can be done needs to lay on you as the supervisor, and maybe not so much as blame on that person. That's easier said than done because we can get in these difficult positions with certain staff, but if you can think about it in that way, the same way that you wouldn't necessarily blame a student for not being able to do what you've asked them to do, it removes that bias that you may have. So reviewing those other steps and making sure that you really have explained what the outcomes are that you're going towards and how that's going to be done, and trained and trained and trained. Because it is unethical to punish without training, retraining, and teaching again, in the same way that it is unethical to really address non-proficient staff performance with some type of action plan that doesn't look at, have I identified the skills, trained, retrained, and retaught. So if you've done that, you've gone back through and you know that you as a supervisor have done everything that you can, then you might need to move into some corrective supervision. I, of course, have dealt with some really, really difficult personalities and some really, really difficult teachers, and gone through all of these steps and said, I got nothing. I've done it. I've done what I'm supposed to do, and she's still not doing the business. So I had to then move into corrective supervision, but make sure, once again, that you have checked those first 5 steps before you get to this point. Corrective supervision really needs to look at, is it a performance deficit or a skill deficit? So if it's a skill deficit, you know that person just doesn't know how to do what you're asking them to do. Those first 5 steps will help you get there and help you teach that person. But it should also tell you something. If they have not gained the skill already by you looking at and reviewing again those first 5 steps, you need to change what you're doing. Maybe your method isn't working as a way for them to understand it. Maybe bring somebody else in if you have the ability to do so. Think about teaching in a different way. That will help address that skill deficit. But if it's a performance deficit, you may be talking about something different. There you really need to check resources and motivation. So lack of resources, if you have the ability to really identify the barriers that may be in the way for that person and what you can provide in terms of support, it's possible that that performance deficit will be taken care of. Possible. But it's probably a combination of motivation and maybe some lack of resources. Motivation or lack of motivation is the majority of the staff issues that I have encountered and I see and have reported to me. I get called in to take care of those hard teachers sometimes, and part of what I have to do is really build a relationship with them first as a way to really look at what are those motivating operations or those factors that are going on that they aren't doing what they're supposed to do. That's really, really difficult for the administrator that's in the building to do, because that person doesn't have the motivation already, and having an administrator that is evaluative to their actual job sometimes is a bigger barrier than it is a good thing. So really think about, is there someone else that you can pull in that isn't taking time and resources away from something else, because I know that that's always in everyone's mind, but is there someone else that you can pull in that can just try a different way or get at what the motivation is that's in the way for this person? Because it can be really, really difficult. And just thinking about that skill deficit to performance deficit part of things, the performance deficit is harder to fix than the skill deficit. We are teachers in this room, and whether your job says teacher or not, that's what you're doing because you're working with other people. that is something that we can do. That's easy. Lack of motivation or that performance deficit, that's the harder part. But if you can identify that that's what you're dealing with, you can then have some implementation or some interventions around that are specific to motivation, as opposed to trying to get them to do something because you told them to do it. We always want to be promoting an ethical work environment, and that comes along with always pushing professional development and ethics. And thinking about in the same way that you are supporting that Proficient teacher with maybe providing books, resources, journal articles, maybe that is something that you can do with the non-Proficient staff. It may not be something that they are willing to open or look at or do, but that could be a way for them to feel valued or feel seen that can address some of those performance deficits that happen. The last step in the evidence-based protocol is to continuously evaluate staff performance and those kind of goal attainment outcomes. This needs to be done continuously, and it is not something that has to be extra. A lot of what you guys already do will give you information on the staff impact on consumers. Remember, consumers include students. You have tons of information and data just by the nature of what we do in schools on how our implementation, how our staff is impacting our students. So if you can just look at that information and say, is what we're doing working? Then you don't have to do something else. It's not another thing that's on your plate. You already have the information. It's just looking at it through the lens of, is my supervision being effective? It should, of course, always be data-driven. If we are asking our teachers to take data, we should, as supervisors, also be taking data, talk about it, show them, let them see that it is something that we do as a way to encourage them to be doing it as well, because sometimes that's a really big thing to ask. But also understand that drift happens. So remember that I already talked about drift, kind of getting away from that level of implementation that we want to have. It just happens. The longer you implement something, the less you get away from the level of fidelity that you want to have. But making sure that you recognize that drift happens and are prepared for it is the best thing that you can do. So if you have that good implementation happening, you should still be evaluating to say, is my drift happening now? Is it happening now? Is it happening now? And if your answer is no, then great, keep doing what you're doing. But if you start to notice things slipping, maybe they're not as responsive for what you're asking them to do, the staff. Maybe things are starting to not be as smooth as what they once were. That's drift. So what do you need to do? You need to go back to the original steps that you had put in place. And you need to make sure that you are as supportive and as responsive as you previously were too. Because it can happen as administrators where we're like, things are great, I don't have to do this stuff anymore. But in reality, you need to keep going so that your staff will keep going. And you, as the administrator or the supervisor, you need to make sure that you are reflecting on your own practice. Part of what we teach our teachers to do is be a reflective teacher. Well, you need to be a reflective supervisor. So are you checking to see if your supervision is working? Are you continually looking at that relationship that you have with your staff and or other supervisors? And that relationship doesn't have to be like the big fuzzy warm, we all like each other, but it needs to be, is what I'm doing working? And if it's not working, you need to change. So there are some ways that you can do that. That is required of behavior analysts, and you can see what's required there. But it doesn't necessarily have to be this structured in terms of, I'm going to send everybody a survey and I'm going to ask if they like me. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, the answer is no. They don't like you. It just needs to be something where you are checking and saying, is this working? And am I sticking with as much implementation fidelity as I need to be to once again be helping my staff? One of my favorite ways to do that is, well, the last two are my favorite. Track the number of competencies completed. If you have your task analysis of what you want to have happen, if you're just tracking how many of those are met, this is done. Because if things are being met, then what you're doing is working. But my most favorite way is to note changes in vocabulary. So remember I said you need to be able to kind of talk that implementation talk, but then also talk like a just regular person. Those changes in vocabulary happen over time, and it is really cool to watch your staff recognize it. And if they get to the point where they recognize it, you know you're doing something right and they're learning. But if you start to recognize it, it's typically before they do, you once again know that you're doing something right and it's working. So those changes in vocabulary can be subtle. So maybe they start using the terminology of the model that you're implementing. Maybe they start using, for in my case, things that are much more behavior analytic, or things that are like the teacher technology talk. That means that they're learning something, and if they're learning something, you're doing something right. So that is an easy way to evaluate your supervision that, once again, wouldn't be something else that you guys have to do. So there's a really great article that when I have more time and I do this with other audiences, we go through, because there's an actual example of using this with staff as a way to increase their ability with teaching sign language, but we obviously don't have time to do that today. So if we break it down into something that's a lot more simple and quick, it could look something like this. And the article that I'm talking about, I forgot to say, is listed up at the top there. But if I were to lay out those 7 steps, it could look this quick for someone who's proficient. So if I were to describe the target outcome, I just want somebody to start using reinforcement. So for example, I'm doing an attorney requested FBA right now, and one of the things that I check and take data on is positive statements or just reinforcement provided. There's 0. I've watched this kid for going on 12 hours. 0 reinforcement given to this child. So one of my first recommendations is going to be, just reinforce him a little bit, just something for the poor guy. So this is going to be an actual thing that I'm going to be able to take and do. So more reinforcement being used. So what am I going to want them to do? I'm going to break that down. I'm going to write a goal that's measurable and say, I want you to at least give him 4 positive statements per period. That's all I'm asking. And here's how you're going to do that. And I'm going to write those steps out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is how you're going to do it. Let me show you, because now I'm moving into step 3. Let me show you how that's done. I'll teach that lesson on marine biomes, I don't know. And I will show you that I can reinforce him at least 4 times, probably more than that in the period. Let me show you how that's done. Okay, you do it next period. Great job. Why don't you try this as a way to do it as well? That's that behavioral skills training that I'm showing them how to do it, having them practice, and providing feedback. I would then sit back the next time that they're working with that child and make sure that it's still happening. So observational data and fidelity checklist. I already have my task analysis. There's my fidelity checklist. Did you do the steps that I was asking you to do? And if you didn't, all right, let's work on that. That gives us something to do. For someone who's doing it and doing it well, I'm going to provide them reinforcement. If they're not, I'm going to retrain, and if I have to move into corrective supervision, I can do that. But first I would go back through all of the previous steps. And then I'm going to continually pop in and check for drift. Are you still doing it? Do we need to up the ante? Can we get up to 7 now? How's he doing? So I'm checking for those things. So it doesn't have to be this huge process that takes forever, but it does need to be something that is formulated with a protocol that has a framework so that you are doing the best that you can and getting the outcomes for the students that you want. And of course, there's barriers. There's always barriers. Your time and your efficiency are 2 of the biggest barriers. This does take effort. This does take time. But if you are able to do it in a small way, or at least somewhat, for some teachers, then you are going to be ahead of the game. So I understand, yeah, you want me to do these 7 steps? Okay, great. I understand that's a lot to ask, and it's easier to stand up here on a stage and talk about it than to actually do it. But it can be done, and it can be done well, and it will impact students, which is what we ultimately want. The other issue that you're going to have, and I'm sure that you can all agree with this, is staff acceptance and buy-in. This is a different way of addressing training, addressing our staff. But if you can get that relationship with staff where they're comfortable with you teaching and training and helping, that's the way that you want to go forward. There may be staff that are very standoffish to that. There's many ways that you can address that. It has to be something that's very individualized, and once again, look at that staff motivation. And some ideas and resources to help you get to the point of maybe doing some of this. So Bailey and Birch are both behavior analysts who have a lot of publications and books. I recommend the ethics scenarios because it would give you a view into a lot of the problems that you will or already do face within your schools and how to kind of get around them. There are also ideas for you to have tools of what to do when you come up against things that maybe you haven't had to deal with yet. There's also, once again, from Bailey and Birch, professional behavior self-evaluations that can be a survey of your own self, professional behavior, or your own staff, have them complete it for their own professional behavior. It's another way to assess what professional behaviors are lacking or within strength, and then that can be something that can become goals, can become part of their evaluation process if they're creating goals. It can really be something that just gives more information. One of my favorite things to do is have the supervisee actually create an agenda for the meeting. So if I say, hey, my coaching day with you is next Wednesday, I would like you to send me an agenda for what you would like to happen that day on Tuesday, so that I have time to look at it, I have time to prepare if there's something on there. But staff is more likely to tell you what they would like to work on through writing, honestly, than verbally state it to you. It also gives them time to think about what they want to have happen or what they need help with. And the other part about it is we're working with adults. Part of what does work with adults is a little bit of their participation in the formulation of what you do with them. So if you're giving them that option, it's very similar to giving our students choice. So having them create that agenda can then be that kind of shared governance that will help the relationship as a supervisor, but also give you that view into what they feel they are good at or need help with. And the other thing that goes along with that that is really useful is having the supervisee create a way that they will use when you're there to take notes on what's happening. Remember I said, like, explain to them what the behaviors that work for you for them receiving feedback are. Part of that may be note-taking, but if I say to you, take notes, you're gonna do it in a way that fits with you and your brain and how you learn. But if I provide you some structure of how to do it, it may not work with how your understanding functions. So if I ask them to do it, and it may just be a piece of paper that they're using, and maybe not like an actual template, it aligns better with their way of processing information, and also then is a backup for what we did that day and documentation. Aubrey Daniels is a leader in the field of organizational behavior management. Really, really good stuff. Blogs, websites, books, trainings, lots of it for free on creating change within organizations. I highly recommend anything that you can get your hands on by Aubrey Daniels. If you're looking for some specific criteria, I kept saying make a task analysis, make a task analysis. If you are looking for specific criteria for some of the things that you're going to be asking your staff to do, you can always look at the BACB task list, because those are actual concepts and competencies that are already laid out as a way to support what you're doing, so that you don't have to be kind of pulling stuff out of thin air. Anytime that you're creating anything or finding anything or pulling anything for a teacher, put it in a manual so that you don't have to do it the next time. This is not going to be like a I only had to do this with one teacher kind of situation. There's so many different situations or teachers that you guys are going to come up against in your supervision that it's just easier and helps to streamline, especially when one of the barriers is your time and efficiency. It helps to just get everything put together in a manual, so then you can just pull that out when you have it. And then there's some more ethical challenges or ethical questions that you can pull from if needed to help you in some of those situations. So that is all I have for you. If anyone has any questions about this riveting topic. No? Great. Well, I will be here if you have any. It was nice to spend some time with you. Thank you.